Have you noticed this? We are always talking about generations, always trying to explain who ruined what and why things changed. Boomers destroyed the economy, millennials ruined industries, Gen Z lives inside the phone. There is always a story being repeated. But in the middle of all that noise, there is a generation that almost never becomes the center of attention. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, quiet, unnoticed, rarely asking for attention or recognition. They do not make noise, they do not need applause, they do not turn effort into identity, and that is not random. Imagine this. It is 1978, you are 8 years old, and the school bus leaves you in front of your house. You walk alone to the door, holding a key around your neck, and there is no one waiting for you. You open the door, and the house is completely empty. No adult asking how your day went. No supervision, no conversation. You prepare something to eat, turn on the television, and simply wait. That was not unusual. It was normal. Millions of children grew up like this without anyone noticing anything was missing. When a child learns too early that no one is coming to help, something inside begins to change permanently. You learn independence, but also something deeper. If something goes wrong, it is your responsibility to fix it. You cannot ask for permission, you cannot search for answers, you cannot negotiate outcomes, you decide and then accept the result. Psychologists call this a high-contingency environment, where actions and consequences are directly connected without emotional buffering. This trains the brain to anticipate, to think 2 or 3 steps ahead, not because of fear, but because mistakes happen alone. That is why many of them seem to see problems before they happen, not because they expect the worst, but because they learn to calculate it. It is not pessimism, it is constant simulation, a mind that runs scenarios in advance to avoid facing them unprepared. A brain trained from childhood to think ahead, to reduce risk, to imagine what could go wrong before it actually does. But here's where it becomes more interesting. They grew up hearing about stability while watching the world prove otherwise. They were told about loyalty and long-term security while seeing layoffs, divorces, and institutions failing in real time. The implicit message became clear. Not everything that promises safety is actually safe, and that changes how you see the world. This does not create hate, it creates cautious distrust, a quiet distance from things that look stable but might not be. Psychologists call this defensive pessimism, expecting the best while still preparing yourself for what could go wrong. Because when you have seen things go wrong more than once, you stop calling it bad luck and start calling it a pattern. From the outside, this may look like cynicism, but it is not. It is pattern recognition built through real experience. That mindset builds something important, an emotional armor that is quiet, invisible, but always present. They do not dramatize everything. They do not turn every emotion into something public. They simply process things differently. They do not need constant recognition because they grew up in environments where recognition was not always present. There were no rewards for handling things alone, no validation for solving problems quietly. You just did it and moved on. This creates adults who do not depend on external validation, but also adults who sometimes do not know how to receive it. There is something else, privacy. When they grew up, life was not constantly recorded or exposed to everyone. If something embarrassing happened, only a few people knew, not millions, and that changes how you experience visibility. For them, constant exposure does not feel natural. It feels risky, because visibility always carries vulnerability. If you learned early that vulnerability can be costly, you prefer to observe instead of constantly putting yourself out there. They also developed a very specific kind of humor, distant, ironic, where almost anything can become a joke. Nothing feels too serious on the surface, not because it is not important, but because distance makes things easier to handle. They grew up in a world that often felt unstable, with mixed messages and environments that did not fully make sense. Adults said everything was fine, but the environment suggested something very different, and that contradiction leaves a mark. When the environment is uncertain, emotional detachment becomes protection. If you do not get too involved, it hurts less. But here's the paradox. Despite the instability, they developed a strong and almost invisible work ethic. They do not talk about productivity, they do not present discipline as identity, they simply do what needs to be done. Many started working early, delivering newspapers, helping in stores, learning to solve real problems at a young age. These were not activities to build a perfect future. They were real introductions to responsibility and practical life. They learned something important. You cannot control the system, but you can control how capable and useful you become. You cannot avoid a crisis, but you can make sure you are useful when it happens, and that becomes a quiet form of security. This creates a silent drive to become indispensable, not for recognition, but to feel safe in an unpredictable world. Here comes a strong contrast. They are deeply independent, but when someone needs help, they show up without making it visible. Loyalty is not performance. It is not something to display. It is something you do without turning it into a story. Because when you grow up relying on friends instead of adults, friendship becomes structure, not just a choice. Authority has a different meaning for them. They do not respect titles automatically. They respect real competence. If you know what you are doing, they will follow you. If not, they will create distance without making it obvious. They grew up watching serious mistakes made by people in power, and that changes how you relate to authority. They learned that following without questioning can have consequences, and that creates adults who think before they trust. Economically, they lived through multiple crises. Nothing felt permanent, and stability never seemed guaranteed. That is why many of them diversify their income, not as a trend, but as a response to everything they experienced. But every strength has a cost. Studies show they seek less emotional support during stress, not because they do not need it. They were taught something very early: solve it yourself, and that message stays even when help would be useful. This makes them incredibly effective in crisis, but it can also make vulnerability feel uncomfortable or even unsafe. Letting someone help, allowing support, or admitting you cannot do everything alone can feel unfamiliar. Generation X was not raised with applause. It was raised with responsibility without constant validation or recognition. That created adults who do not need recognition to act, but sometimes also do not ask for it when they deserve it. They became the bridge between analog and digital, between promised stability and experienced uncertainty. Bridges are not celebrated. They simply hold, connect, and allow others to pass without asking for attention. The question is not whether this made them strong. The question is how much of that armor is still necessary today. Because learning early that you are on your own can make you strong, but it can also make you carry more than you need. If this made you understand something about yourself, stay, subscribe, and keep exploring how your mind really works.